Hello and welcome to lesson 3 on Piaget, and to be more specific, it is what is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. We are going to obviously continue with our exploration of brain development. Piaget was a Swiss psychologist who was around about the time of 1896 to 1980. He predominantly studied children and their cognitive development. He believed that schemas were the key to cognitive development, and he described how they developed as a child grew up. Schemas are essentially blocks of knowledge that develop in response to our experience of life, of the world. And he believed that babies are born with very simple schemas for sucking and grasping. And as the baby grows, new schemas develop. So to give you an example, a young child might see a bed. A young child might see a sofa. These are pretty basic building blocks of knowledge or schemas. However, as the child grows older, due to having these particular schemas, sofa and bed, a child will be able to develop a more advanced schema. Those two will come together to form the building block of sofa bed. But you can only understand the notion of sofa bed if you A, understand what a sofa is, and B, obviously understand the concept of a bed. What you have done there is you have assimilated. In other words, you have built upon your pre-existing schemas, which all very much help you develop cognitively. However, if the schema sometimes is, you may sometimes need to change a schema or develop a new schema to cope with a new situation. That's rather abstract. Let me explain. So say, for example, you see a clown at a circus. That clown has a pale white face, a big red nose, a bald head, and a rather big belly. Now, if a young child was to see an adult that looks very similar, maybe in a supermarket, he or she might mistakenly identify that adult as a clown. Of course, a responsible adult would be, "Shh, he's not a clown," and obviously inform the child of actually that is an elderly man that just happens to look like a clown. Now, the child therefore has got new information, which has subsequently led to them having to change a schema or at least develop a new schema to cope with that new situation. So there are two ways in which we develop our schemas: assimilation and accommodation. And it is going through those processes that we develop our ability to learn and to think. Now, Piaget believed that there are 4 stages to children's intellectual development. He said that all children pass through the stages in the same order and roughly at the same age. However, some adults may not actually get through all of the stages. Typically they do. The first 3 stages are as follows. We have the sensory motor stage, which children enter at ages 0 to 2. In this stage, children learn about the world through their senses, hence sensory, and by doing things, hence motor, sensory motor. The main feature of sensory motor stage is that the child has object permanence. In other words, knowing the object still exists even though it is out of sight. It is why, for example, a very young child is fascinated with the notion of peepo, because they genuinely believe that the adult or whoever is playing that game has actually disappeared, because they haven't yet gained object permanence. It very much is out of sight. It's out of mind, but out of the world. You can't see it. So object permanence. And in fact, Piaget did a brief investigation on this. He watched to see whether or not the children would search for a toy, which he subsequently hid under a blanket. He found that children under the age of 8 months did not search for the toy because they genuinely believed that it had disappeared, whereas children older than this actually then sought out the toy, and many of them found that it was under the blanket because they knew it was still there. Just because they couldn't see it, it didn't mean that it ceased to exist. Piaget then explored the next cognitive stage of development, which is the pre-operational stage. This is 2 to 7. At this stage, he believed that children are what he called egocentric, and he investigated this by using the Three Mountains model. He placed a doll somewhere besides the model, beside it, from a different angle from what the child was sitting, and how the child could perceive that same model. The child was then shown photos that had been taken from the perspective of the model. Now the child had to choose the photo showing the view that the doll could see. He found that children under the age of 7 chose a photo that showed their own view, obviously illustrating the fact that they could just not see the mountain from the perspective of the doll, and thus tells us that the child is egocentric up until the age of 7. Penultimately, we have the concrete operational stage, which is when a child approaches 7 up until the age of 11. Concrete operational stage tells us that Piaget believes that a significant feature, with a child at 7 to 11, is a child has the ability of conservation. This is to say that they know that the amount of something stays the same, even though it appears it may change. There are a number of studies that can be used in relation to conservation. You might have 2 equal glasses, exactly the same size and shape, but if you were to pour one into a long, thin tube and the water appeared to be significant, and pour the other into a rather shallow base kind of beaker, if you will, the child would always believe there was more water, more liquid in the long-shaped tube. He primarily used counters, and he set up 2 rows of counters, each with an equal number of counters on each row. He then spread out one set of counters, leaving the other exactly as is, not adding any counters to each row. He then asked the child which row has more counters. He concluded that almost all children pointed to the fact that there were more counters in the row which had been spread out. Piaget therefore believed that children lacked the ability of conservation until the age of 11.